Good afternoon and welcome to Live from the Eagle's Nest. I'm Sarah Gannon from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Library here at the National Conservation Training Center. Today we will be talking to the authors of Beauty and the Beak, How Science, Technology, and a 3D printed beak rescued a bald eagle. Welcome Deborah Lee Rose and Jane Veldkamp. In the second half of our show, Randy Robinson and FWS biologist Jim Siegel will recap the unusual events of the 2024 nesting season at NCTC. We look forward to your questions and comments, which you may begin putting in the chat now. But first, thank you to our partners at the Outdoor Channel, friends of the NCTC, the production team, and Bald Eagles 101. Thank you to our audience for joining us. As we get started, put in the chat where you're joining us from. And for any teachers watching today, please share your school and where your class is joining from. If you've read Beauty and the Beak, let us know. Let's dive in and introduce our authors of Beauty and the Beak. This is a fantastic children's book based on the real-life story of a bald eagle named Beauty's injury, rescue, and rehabilitation, made possible by biologists and innovative 3D printing technology. Jane and Deborah's partnership was also made possible by technology, since they've been collaborating from a distance from Montana to Maryland on their books. Also, images from NCTC's National Digital Library were used in the book, and we are so excited to share Jane and Deborah's story with you today. Deborah Lee Rose, who is joining us from Maryland today, is an internationally published, award-winning author of 19 children's books, including her latest book, Penguins Ready to Go, 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 and Swoop and Soar, also co-authored with Jane Veldkamp. Jane, who joins us today from Wyoming, is a raptor biologist and master falconer who founded the nonprofit Raptor Education and Rehabilitation Center, Birds of Prey Northwest in northern Idaho in 1993. If you have questions for Deborah and Jane about their book or Birds of Prey Northwest, please put them in the chat anytime. Thank you both for joining us.
My pleasure.
How did the two of you decide to collaborate on telling Beauty's story?
I'll start with that one. I had been reading about Beauty and was fascinated by the story. And there was no way I felt I could do the book without speaking to Janie, because it was her story, her work. So when I contacted her on her bird rescue phone line, we began to talk. And so quickly, I realized we had to do it together, and we made the joint decision to do every piece of the book together. Every word, every picture choice, every plot decision, every emotion imbued into the story was collaborative. And that was a fantastic experience because her knowledge is encyclopedic. My job is to translate her scientific and technical knowledge for audiences who may not have any of that background.
Fantastic. Jane, tell us more about Birds of Prey Northwest and your work.
Birds of Prey Northwest was founded 30 years ago, actually, and it has a twofold mission statement. Our educational component to use live birds of prey to teach is at the foremost of our mission statement. We also provide medical treatment to injured wild raptors in need of medical care with the hopes of getting them back to the wild. All this work, by the way, is done on special U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service permits.
Fascinating. Can you tell us more about Beauty and how she came to need help and how you rescued her?
Yes, Beauty was shot illegally in Dutch Harbor, Alaska, and she was transported to Anchorage, where they have a rehabilitation center there for injured birds of prey, such as bald eagles. And I happened to be on a vacation there, traveling Alaska, and stopped in an Anchorage facility to visit them there at a facility much like our own. And there at the end of the lineup, I met this bald eagle without a beak they called Beauty. And I asked them what will happen to this bald eagle. And they stated that she would be likely euthanized because her beak did not grow back in the year that she had been there. Well, as a former nurse, I knew that we put prosthetics on children and vets returning from war, so I had the idea, why can't we do this for a bald eagle? And so I flew Beauty the bald eagle to Idaho, where I created a beauty team, a mechanical engineer, a dentist, a veterinarian, and myself a biologist, where it took us 18 months to create the first prototype 3D printed prosthetic beak.
It's lucky that Beauty found you when you were on vacation. Do we have any questions from the audience at this time?
We've got some hellos, Sarah. We've got a hello from Beth in Ann Arbor, Deb Steck out in Arizona, somebody up in Quebec, Canada, Joyce from Greenboro, North Carolina, Susan from right here in Shepherdstown. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
I would also like to add, Sarah, that this book, as well as Swoop and Soar About Two Orphaned Osprey, are STEM teaching books, as well as they have free accompanying educational guides for teachers that go along with the books that are free to download from the Birds of Prey Northwest website.
And Beauty's story is known worldwide because Janie and Beauty were featured on Nat Geo Wild, and also the book is read worldwide. And by creating free materials online, anyone can access them, because Janie felt that this story needed to be told everywhere, and that was exactly what I wanted to do too.
And here at NCTC, we were able to use your website, birdsofpreynorthwest.org, to recreate Beauty's prosthetic beak by using your file and downloading it. It's available for teachers, free to teachers in Idaho schools. Have there been more uses of 3D printing for rehabilitation of birds at Birds of Prey Northwest or other centers?
A center in South America has used a toucan's missing beak with a 3D prosthetic, and I do believe Winter the dolphin benefited from a prosthetic that was created on a 3D printer.
And the Smithsonian National Zoo also helped a bird, and you see more and more stories. And the number of other kinds of animals receiving prosthetics now, especially pets, is growing so fast. I'll never forget at one school, a little child was trying to tell me about their grandparent who had a prosthetic, and they called it their grandpa's beak, even though it wasn't a beak. So that is what we wanted to do, is make that really strong connection between Beauty and the much larger world of people getting prosthetics for all kinds of reasons.
And one of the limitations we discovered from this procedure with the bald eagle Beauty is that beaks are like fingernails. In fact, they're made of the same composition of keratin. And as you well know, your fingernails grow at a constant, slow rate. And this was the limitation for birds and their prosthetics, because the remaining beak, however badly damaged, continues to push out new growth, thereby eventually pushing off the prosthetic.
That is fascinating. So you all have been pioneers in this field, and it's becoming more common. Deborah, can you tell us a bit about your writing process and how you come up with ideas for new books?
Well, kids ask me that, and the honest truth is ideas come from everywhere for me. Sometimes they seem to come out of the blue, but for Beauty, I had been reading a lot about animal prosthetics. I was fascinated by it, but her story was the most powerful one that I came across, and I made the decision that her story could stand alone. Then the process grew as Janie and I began to work together. Countless hours of telephone calls, emails, and often Janie would be on the road with raptors going to schools or traveling across the country, and we would get interrupted by storms and lost connections. But Beauty's very tenacious, and we're very tenacious, and we just hung in there to get this story told. A second part of the process was absolutely U.S. Fish and Wildlife photographs, getting into my imagination, because we made the decision to tell Beauty's story from the very beginning of her life, from the nest. And you know that eagle nests are so exciting to people. So we started in the nest, and so many of those photos came from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and now teach kids about the entire species.
Thank you. That's a great reminder that the National Digital Library has about 30,000 public domain images available for anyone who wants to use them.
Spectacular.
Jane, one of the most frequent questions we get at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is what to do when you find wildlife that's been injured. What should someone do if they find an injured eagle?
Well, first of all, do not try to rescue the eagle on your own without experience or necessary safety equipment. I would advise the citizen to stand nearby the eagle to keep an eye on it, and in the meantime, call for the help of a federally permitted wildlife rehabilitator, such as myself, or call a fish and game officer, who often is trained in capturing wild animals. The bird then needs to be safely captured, x-rayed, and sent to a rehabilitation center for rehabilitation and return back to the wild.
Thank you. Do we have any questions coming in from the audience?
Well, we do have one, Sarah. This is from Deb out in Arizona. She's asking, how is Beauty doing today?
Beauty's doing quite well, thank you. She no longer lives with her prosthetic beak. As I stated earlier, the new growth is constantly growing and eventually pushed off the prosthetic beak. So my husband, Don, created a feeding platform for Beauty. And there we drop strips of salmon over the feeding board, and Beauty gets under there with her good lower beak and scoops up the strips of salmon.
I wanted to mention that I had the chance to see Beauty close up in Idaho, and I can affirm she's doing phenomenally. And even without her beak, her eyes are so intense when they look at you, and I have never felt a connection with a wild animal like that before.
You know, it's interesting, when Beauty's prosthetic was in place, people didn't understand the nature of her injury or why she was in captivity. But now, without her beak, she's a stark reminder of one of the leading causes of death of eagles, both bald and golden in our country, is illegal shooting. And so the greater educational component of this book is to remind the audience that it's against the law to shoot an eagle. It just doesn't make sense anyway.
Thank you. If you had one takeaway for our audience today, what would you like them to know?
You go first, Jude. Okay.
Well, we share our world with wild animals, and whether we're urban bound or we live on a farm, we need to find a way to coexist with them. And they're particularly sensitive to technologies like wind turbines, pesticides of the past like DDT, and structures like power poles, which can electrocute them. So we need to find a way to live in harmony with wildlife and reduce the conflict between humans and wild animals.
And my takeaway is that Janie's work has rescued so many animals, and she teaches at her center and at schools and libraries in multiple states. But creating a book together that could tell the story puts her work out to hundreds of thousands of students, teachers, librarians, parents, and can inspire other people to care for and protect wildlife. And when I learned more about her other work, including her work with osprey rescue, then we moved forward doing our second book together, Swoop and Soar, about her extraordinary rescue of 2 osprey orphans and how she found them a new family in the wild, which is such a completely different story than Beauty's. But that's the beauty of writing a children's book about these extraordinary stories. We can share them so broadly. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to share them today.
Thank you for
And
being
at
with us.
the heart of conservation, for me, I can't change the attitude of the person that tried to kill Beauty or shoots any bald eagle. But you give me an hour with a 3rd grade son or daughter, and they'll grow up to revere and respect wildlife. It begins with the youth.
Thank you. Future generations. Can viewers find Swoop and Soar on birdsofpreynorthwest.org also?
Yes.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
We do, Sarah, and I would encourage anybody out there to go ahead and put questions in for the authors of Beauty and the Beak. Here's a few questions here. How old is Beauty today?
Beauty is 27 years old this year, and eagles in the wild live to be about 20 to 25 years of age. However, in captivity, where you remove the mortality factors of electrocution, lead poisoning, illegal shooting, car strikes, bald and golden eagles in captivity as teaching birds can live up to 50 years of age.
Okay, Deb is asking, is Beauty an educational ambassador now? And if so, where can we visit her?
Yes, she is held on a special U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service permit as a display educational bald eagle. You can visit us at birdsofpreynorthwest.org near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. We give tours by appointment, and you can visit Beauty and all the other raptors at our facility by going to our website, birdsofpreynorthwest.org.
And it's fantastic also on your website that you've made these STEM or science, technology, engineering, and math curriculum available, and the 3D printed beak that Sarah has in her hand. She was showing that a little while. Maybe we can get another shot of that. That was actually printed here at NCTC by John on his 3D printer from the file that he downloaded from the Birds of Prey Northwest website. And so any teacher, homeschooler can do that, assuming you have a printer that will do that work. So that's pretty amazing. I think students would love to try that out. Thanks for making that available out on your website,
Sure.
Jane.
And as you look at this beak, look at how organic the nature of the jagged edges are, how much more of the beak is missing on one side than the other. It was a very difficult prosthetic to make and fit to the bald eagle. And the hole in the top of the beak, in addition to the dental and surgical glue we used, the hole in the top of the beak is where the screw went in, so it had a dual attachment. Remember, the force applied to an eagle's beak is tremendous when they're ripping food, tearing into flesh, or even preening the quills of their feather.
One of the reasons I also got excited about this story is because I'm fascinated by animal adaptations, which is a major curriculum topic in elementary school. So in the book, we talk a lot about how the beak is adapted, how the talons are adapted, and how they work together. And then we wanted to combine engineering because that is being taught in elementary schools much more than ever before. So here we are connecting biology and engineering, just as bioengineers are doing for human patients all the time. So this is opening a door to a lot of new knowledge and exploration for kids.
So Jay Church is asking, how long until Beauty's beak fully grows back?
Oh, in about 100 years. Not to be cynical, but at 2 millimeters of growth over the last 15 years, it's a very slow growth rate. And so it's much like a fingernail. The more badly damaged it is back into the quick and the blood supply, the slower the regrowth, if at all.
And yet scientists are working to speed up regenerative processes. So
Correct.
just as 3D printing did not exist before, perhaps there will be breakthroughs in keratin regeneration, could change the whole equation.
And while we took 18 months to create the prosthetic beak and the prototype, we only talk about the human side of that. For Beauty, what the eagle had to go through in terms of x-rays, dental impressions, measurements, being cast on a table, fitted, refitted. It's a lot of stress for the bird. So you have to ask yourself as the practitioner, what is the end result for what you're putting the bird through? And is she just better left the way she is as an ambassador?
That's a great point.
So here's a question from Beth. Does Beauty have problems with her tissues getting dry and temperature regulation with her upper beak missing?
Well, in the beginning, she did have problems with a dry tongue, and she does have some problems preening her feathers. So twice a year, we have to pull Beauty and help her preen the feathers she cannot reach with her missing beak. Also in captivity, the talons grow too long with all of our captive educational specimens. So twice a year, we have to help her preen her feathers and trim her talons back. With regard to temperature regulation, you see the size of Beauty there compared to myself. She's a large Alaskan bald eagle and is capable of surviving very, very low temperatures in the Arctic. So temperature regulation is not a problem for Beauty.
So Jane, thanks for all this information. That's great. We have a question on the growth of the beak. Now, on our nest here, we often see the eagles cleaning their beak or sharpening their beak, and as you mentioned, preening their feathers with their beak. In normal growth, does the beak wear down a little bit just from general use, and does the very tip of it grow back?
Well, what you're observing there is the bird feeking its beak after eating. It's cleaning the food scraps from its beak. And in doing so in the wild, it does that on 100 different substrates of different shapes and varying textures. And this, by natural activity, keeps the beak in the proper shape. In captivity, those perches and substrates are limited, and so these birds must have their beaks reshaped in captivity twice a year. It's called coping the beak.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Jane. It was wonderful having you both here with us today. And folks can find the book online and other books that these two authors have written together at birdsofpreynorthwest.org. Now I'll turn it over to Randy Robinson and FWS biologist Jim Siegel to recap the unusual events of the 2024 nesting season at NCTC. They'll take your questions. Please add those to the chat anytime.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Jane and Deborah. That was fantastic to hear about Beauty and the Beak. A great book for teachers. I know there are some teachers who wanted to join us today. Their classroom schedule didn't permit it, but we are recording this, so it will be available towards the end of today. I believe it's going to be on the same YouTube link that you're looking at right now. I believe the recording will be there. So look for that, and we'd like to thank all of our teachers and students for tuning in, everybody today for joining us. And right now I'd like to introduce my colleague here, Jim Siegel. Jim is a biologist, a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He's been here at the training center for many years, worked in our education outreach division. Now he's in our training division. He's a curriculum manager. And he's got a wealth of experience in the field, and in particular with birds and reptiles. Jim's an avid birder, and I was just talking with our folks at headquarters this morning, and their new survey tells us that 96 million people in the country identify themselves as birders or having an interest in birds. I think that's kind of lumped in maybe feeding birds in the backyard, actively going out and birding. And Jim does lead bird trips here at NCTC, and of course we've been observing our bald eagles here for 20 years now.
Yes, it's been a great experience, and I learned something new about bald eagles every year.
So Jim, I'm going to just sort of lay out the context especially for viewers that are maybe here for the first time, and talk about what we've seen over 20 years. We put the first cameras up on the nest back in 2005. The nest was actually built in the first year in 2003. They laid the first eggs in 2004. So for 20 years, every season was sort of predictable. We did have different adult birds. We've had 2 different females, and now, as of this fall, 3 different males. But every year, every season, we sort of saw this regular pattern that we kind of got used to. They'd be gone more or less in the summer, but in the fall they return. and they bring sticks in and to build up that nest. That's their bonding ritual. They build that nest up. They mate early, about mid-January, and then they lay eggs around Valentine's Day, usually mid-February. And eggs normally hatch 35, 38 days later, so about mid-March, the eggs hatch. And for the next 3 months, roughly 12 weeks, from the day the bird hatches till it fledges is about 3 months. They grow amazingly fast. And during that time, we've seen our adults here take, amazing care of these young ones. They're on the nest night and day, snow, rain, sleet, ice. And once the eggs hatch, they feed them. They'll take fish is their favorite food, but they'll take their beak and very delicately feed the young ones. And we've seen that at this nest and many nests around the country. Bald Eagles 101, they are looking at nests, probably 50 of them around the country with cameras. We've seen similar behavior. So we know that that's kind of built into normal behavior in the bald eagles. But this year has been a little bit different. In the fall, our resident male was chased off, most likely by another male. A new male appeared at the nest, and he's been here since September. Anyway, the new male bonded with the female. They did, like I mentioned, brought in sticks, mated, laid eggs. There were 3 eggs laid. One of the eggs broke. Now, being a new male, we know he's a new male because he's still got some black feathers on his head. And that indicates to us he's about 4.5 years old. So very likely this is his first experience at nesting and incubating eggs. And he did pretty good. He was sitting on the eggs. Took a little sort of getting used to, but the female does it, especially in cold weather. She's on the nest about 80% of the time, we can say, roughly. But the male does take turns. He also has a brood patch, a bare area of skin like the female does. And so he was doing that. But the day the eggs hatched, he actually preyed on that young eaglet. That would have been May or April 8th was the first hatch. And then again did the same thing on Thursday when the second bird hatched. So a whole lot of questions from our viewers. None of us had ever seen anything like that before. It is very rare. We know, and you and I have talked with other biologists at our headquarters, other biologists in the Fish and Wildlife Service and at research institutions. And, that kind of behavior is not unheard of, but we could say it's uncommon. Jim, could you talk a little bit about how bald eagles behave, what makes them sort of do certain behaviors?
Yeah, I think it's very important for us to know that bald eagles are very hardwired. And what I mean by that is almost everything that they're doing is instinctual behaviors that they don't learn from their parents or from other bald eagles. They know how to migrate. They know how to build a nest, to fly, to sit on eggs, to breed, to fight for the territory, to fish, to catch fish out of the river. These are all behaviors that they learn on their own, and they don't do that from learning from their parents. And that's an important thing to know. And so as a result, every year the correct kind of hormonal and physiological processes in the bird's body results in behaviors that are adaptive to their lifestyle in their chosen environment, in this case, living on the banks of the Potomac River. And normally, everything works out well. The correct hormones are flowing, the correct physiological conditions inside the bird's bodies are in balance. And so the behavior is normal, and they successfully live year after year. As you heard, they can live for 25 to 50 years if they're able to do all these things correctly. But occasionally, and rarely, it happens that they eat their own eggs and young. And they are not the only animal that this kind of behavior has been shown. It is not particularly uncommon in various kinds of animals in the cat family, in the dog family, different kinds of rodents, different kinds of rabbits, certain kinds of fish, reptiles and birds, some of those animals are more likely to eat their own eggs and young under various stressful conditions. I think that's important to note, that under stressful conditions, such as having to fight for your territory, having to fight for your mate, not having enough food or the proper nutrition, can sometimes result in aberrant behaviors, kind of maladaptive behavior that we saw at the nest this past week or so.
And thanks for your questions. We've got some very interesting questions coming in, folks, so keep them coming, and Jim and I will get to them in just a little bit here. We know there's lots of questions about what we saw. So we'll just kind of break down. I gave some context, and we want to make this understandable for students as well. So we're not going to get into any big terms here, biological terms or chemical terms, but just in general, we sort of have four categories, broad categories of ideas. You know, we may never know for sure what caused this behavior at the nest, but these are just ideas here, and some of the research that we'll talk about will bear some of this out. So one idea is that I'll just run through this list and then we'll go back and talk about each of them. First, he's a new male. He's 4.5, 5 years old, his first nest. He got confused. And those that witnessed this say he appeared restless, agitated, somewhat confused, if we can say that about a bird. And maybe he was hungry, or maybe both. So that's one. Another idea is population pressure. The numbers of bald eagles have risen dramatically across the country, especially here in the Mid-Atlantic, and we've got well over 300,000 bald eagles across the United States now, dramatically higher from what it was 50 years ago, or even 10 years ago. So the populations are rising. We've got young males and females up and down the Potomac every day. Number three, we've got some environmental contaminants in our rivers. It's a long list with lots of acronyms like PCBs and PFAS that has been making the news in drinking water. Dioxins.
Insecticides.
Pesticides, and so on. A long list.
Heavy metals is another big one.
Many of those. In general, we call those environmental contaminants. And then a fourth idea was maybe this specific bird had a neurological issue. And we do have a question about that. Or maybe there was some issue with his eyesight. He looks normal. That would be hard to tell. But let's go back and sort of, those are the broad categories. Let's talk about some of those. First off, he's a new male. Confused, hungry, both? What do you think about that?
It's hard to say that wild animals ever really get confused. It's hard to know what confusion is. I think these are different than some of our dogs and cats that may be living in our home. These animals are beautifully adapted to their lifestyle and to their environment. So I think confusion might be hard to know, but I think that some of its aberrant behavior was apparent, that some people saw that the animal didn't seem to be looking at its feet a lot, seemed to be hunched over a little bit, and that suggests that the animal may not have been in the perfect health. To me, that suggests that.
And so along that line of thought, Jim, here's a question we'll take from Brittany. Why is it too late in the season for a second clutch of eggs? And also, why does Scout seem to bow a lot? And let's take the second part first, since we're on that topic. He's been seen sort of, it's very subtle too. Most people don't notice it, but if you watch him for a long time, he kind of looks at his feet or sort of bows, so to speak, like taking a bow.
Right. Some of the toxins that you mentioned in your long list have neurological effects on the animal, and it can make the animal look stressed out, not alert. And suggesting the bowing of the behavior that you've mentioned might be showing that the animal was suffering some neurological effect, and that might be caused by having lead in its system, or having some of the metals and pesticides that you mentioned. Those might be some of the effects that might have be the result of that. The first part of the question was, again, just repeat the first part of the question again.
Oh, the first part from Brittany was,
Yes,
why is it too late in the season for a second clutch of eggs to be laid?
Right. That's a great question. When you realize is the female had to be very fat and healthy to be able to sit on the nest for 35 days without getting a lot of food brought in by her partner. And so, in effect, she is kind of losing weight sitting on those eggs for 35 days. If she laid another clutch of 1 to 3 eggs, she would have to sit on the nest for another 35 days. And so her nutrition and her condition would be probably very poor after sitting on the nest without a lot of food for 70 days. But there's a whole nother thing that I think you have to think about. Right now, the temperatures are cool. In midsummer, when those eggs would hatch after another 35 days, that would be under very warm conditions. And the birds don't get to drink at all when they're in the nest. The babies don't get to drink. They get all their moisture from the fish and other prey that they're fed. So I don't think that there's enough water for them to be able to survive, to be able to be hatched out in midsummer. So that's, I think, the main reason why these eggs are laid midwinter, in this case, around Valentine's Day.
And we've got a comment from Matt Stuber here. He's an eagle biologist at our headquarters, and he's got a comment that Vanessa sent in, so thanks for doing that, Vanessa. So Matt says, on the breeding question, for most wildlife, there is an optimal time for breeding, like you mentioned about eagles and other predatory birds. When exactly that breeding happens is usually a product of things like food availability, weather, etc. We know the fish spawn here in the Potomac, lots of food available for them.
Particularly a sucker run.
That's right. It's not that wildlife necessarily makes a decision, hey, now it's time to breed, but rather that they have evolved such that certain signals trigger hormonal changes that drive that breeding behavior.
Right. It's a good observation.
And Matt mentions once those signals that cause the hormonal changes are gone, breeding does not happen. So maybe what we might see here is after these hormones get out of the system, that behavior will cease.
Right now, there's no eggs in the nest, and so they're not trying to incubate eggs. The hormones are flowing differently, but they are still mating, so that's interesting to note.
Yes, in fact, here's a question from E.M. Lindley. Can the female leave this male and find a new mate? Well, I'll answer that one, Jim. She could, but Sunday we saw her back in the nest with the same male, bringing in sticks and mating. So they're sticking together. They're
sticking together.
It's their nest. Generally speaking, we always sort of say that the nest belongs to the female. Anything brought into the nest, she claims it, and she's going to feed it to her young. So she's sort of, large and in charge of the nest. She's the bigger bird. The female's a little bigger than the male. She and her mate are back in the nest and sort of going through the motions like they're going to lay another clutch of eggs, but we're just not so sure that will actually happen.
And if it did happen, whether they would be able to go through the entire process again. It is important to note that the river right now is very, very high. I think that fishing might be challenging. There are some seasonal runs of suckers. One is a red horse sucker that happens every year around this time. So this is an important time for the birds to be able to fish and feed their young. And there will be other animals that will be available later in the year, like goslings and ducklings and rabbits and other things later in the season. But right now, it's mostly suckers on the Potomac River.
And here's a follow-up from Matt. He's saying that this pair had all their breeding hormones running full tilt because they were in the middle of it all. And it will take a bit of time for hormone levels to transition to non-breeding status, so to speak. That's why we are still witnessing breeding type of behavior. And then he continues, how hormones change over the course of a breeding season is hard to say. Thank you, Matt and Vanessa. So let's see, let's go back to some questions here. Deb said, going back to Janie and Deborah, to the authors, awesome story, so happy you found Beauty and gave her a second chance. Yes, great story. And Pam said, thank you.
4 minutes.
Thank you for thinking outside the box and finding a way for Beauty to have quality life. Cindy's asking, have there been examples of the male eating its young in one season, successfully rearing eaglets in future seasons?
I couldn't find any. I did a little bit of research after this behavior, and I didn't find a lot of examples of it. I've heard that in peregrine falcons, that sometimes they eat their own eggs and sometimes eat their young. It's a little bit more common than in bald eagles. I think the most common animals where this kind of thing happens are rodents. I used to raise hamsters as a child, and if you disturb the female a lot, she might eat the young. So you have to be very careful about animals with newborn young.
So Claudia is asking, if the male has a neurological disorder, isn't it possible he'll repeat this behavior again if he mates with the female?
I would say that if he's not in good condition, this kind of situation might happen again. It's hard to know. It's hard to know. We don't know if his behavior is the result of some damage.
So Deb has an observation, interesting. She says, and Deb looks at eagle cams all around the country, we do see males bow regularly on eagle cam, and I wondered if this is perhaps a submissive pose. We often see the male bow when he delivers fish or a food source to the female, seen it many times. And then 1 second here, and Matt is saying, Deb is correct on that submissive pose comment. The male may be showing some submissive behavior, so the female won't see him as a threat if he's still trying to copulate with her. Interesting. So let's see. We are getting a little bit short on time. We still have a couple minutes here, so if you have any other questions, go ahead, send them in. Pam is asking, do you think that she, the female, is unaware of his indiscretions?
I don't think these animals have similar emotions and similar feelings as us. I don't think the female is angry at her mate. I don't think she's knowledgeable of the fact that the male has kind of behaved inappropriately. I think these animals are behaving very instinctually, and so I don't think we can attribute those kinds of feelings to her. So I don't think she necessarily considers him a bad mate because of that behavior.
Forrest made a comment, I've seen hamsters eat their young before, and as you mentioned, other animals have been known to do this, many different species. Right. Lori's got a question here, very curious. If this is Scout's first nest, mate, and first eggs, how could he know that that the chick came from that egg if he didn't see it happen, or possibly never saw the female Bella feeding it?
Theoretically, every first eggs that a female lays and that the male sees are the first eggs that it has ever seen. And so all these behaviors are very instinctual, and there's very little learning that takes place here. I'm sure there are females that are good at parental behavior and better than others, and that's why over time these animals have evolved over time to be adapted to their environment and to their specific lifestyles.
And Lori had a follow-up on that. Perhaps Scout saw this as no different from Bella leaving a baby duckling for lunch in the nest. We've seen baby ducks, baby geese brought into the nest. Yeah, interesting point there. Jeffrey says, eaglet number 2 initially pushed him out of the nest and separated them. Well, as we mentioned, we may never know for sure, but we're going to keep learning and looking into this and researching. Like Jim and I have been looking at published papers, and those are available online. If you search for those, you might be surprised what turns up. But this is new for us. We've been doing this for 20 years and haven't seen this before, but we're learning along with everybody else. So we appreciate everybody's time and attention and all of your questions and observations. Pam says it would have been very educational if the female would have arrived while the eaglets were preyed upon to see her reaction. She was down at the river in both cases getting fish for herself when that happened. And so Laura Lee says, so thankful for this time to learn from you all. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you, Jim, for being here, and Sarah for bringing in Janie and Deborah, talking about beauty in the beak. That was great. Thank you all out there for joining us. Next time, that'll be 2 weeks, May 2nd. We'll have Emily Bier from our Migratory Birds Division here talking about aerial surveys. And if you're in the local Shepherdstown area, NCTC is going to have an open house on Saturday, May 11th. That's the day before Mother's Day, May 11th, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. We welcome our neighbors and the public around. So if you're local, come on out and join us, and we'll have some eagle-related activities here at that time. So once again, take care, everybody. Thanks for joining us today.
Have a great one.